Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Inquirer Live. I am Errin Haines, contributing editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer's A More Perfect Union. And this is a series that is examining the roots of systemic racism in America through institutions that were founded in Philadelphia. We are talking today about our latest installment, Broken Rung, where we explore the history of the building trades in Philadelphia, how Black workers have long been locked out of these organizations, and whether and how, as a city and a society, we can work together to make our unions more equal and more accessible for workers. So joining me today for this discussion, I'm really excited to have with us Juliana Reyes, who researched and wrote the Broken Rung article. Juliana, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So listen, I just want to kick things off by quoting from your piece, which I encourage everyone to read if they have not read it already. In the piece, you write, racism, couched as union solidarity, has always been part of the trades, embedded in their founding stories, their mythology. Their very success, some historians argue, was built on the exclusion of Black workers. And as far back as 1791, when a group of Philadelphia carpenters organized the first recorded building trade strike in the country, the city has been a proving ground for class solidarity. But that solidarity did not transcend racial lines. While white workers demanded their rights, many Black people labored under a brutal system of chattel slavery. This exclusion has flown in the face of a movement that from its very beginnings has claimed to fight for justice and equality. But the question of who gets to be included in the definition of union solidarity has long haunted the labor movement. And for high-wage craft unions, such as the trades, solidarity is often much more exclusive. So for those in the audience who may not have read your article yet, Juliana, can you give us a brief synopsis of what you uncovered in Broken Rung?
Sure, yeah. So the way that we did the story was going as far back into history as possible of the building trades in Philadelphia. And then as a parallel thread, looking at the present day situation for Black workers in trades. And the way we did that was focusing on a Black carpenter named Sharice Ferris. But I can talk about the history part.
Yeah.
So we worked with our research director, Brenna Holland, and other historians to go back to the very beginning of the building trades in Philadelphia. So that was in the late 1700s. And basically, since then, and then until today, we found examples of Black people being excluded systematically through in the trade unions. And so, let's see. So at the very beginning in 1791, at this first recorded building trades strike, which was organized by carpenters, and they were fighting for a 10-hour workday. Basically, there were no Black carpenters that were part of this early union, and that was because, for one, these jobs really came from from your personal community, personal network. And many of the carpenters that many of the master carpenters that hired on carpenters were Quakers. And one of our guests can talk more about that later, Donna Rilling, who I spoke to for the story. But yeah, basically they would recruit from within their networks. And we saw that throughout all our research, that trade unions continued to do this, just recruiting within their networks. And in the 60s, this was especially notable because in Philadelphia, Philadelphia was so segregated then. So if you were recruiting from your networks, you were not going to be recruiting Black people. And there were other things that we found, like within the articles of incorporation for the master carpenters in Philadelphia back then in the 18th century, they levied fees against carpenters who wanted to take on an enslaved apprentice. So they would have to pay thousands of dollars if they wanted to do this. And, that could be seen as abolitionist, and it could also be seen as keeping the craft white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, right. The idea that maybe this was baked in, this inequality was really kind of baked in from the beginning, and the lack of access was barriers to access were kind of there from the start. I'm curious. I mean, you're somebody who has spent a lot of your career covering labor, covering work and workers. What did you learn in reporting from this on this chapter, and what did it? How is it informing your work going forward, do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. So I spent about 2 years as the Inquirer's labor reporter. And so, and I've lived and worked in Philadelphia and reporting for the last more than 10 years. And racism, or well, the exclusion of Black people and the lack of diversity in the building trades is something that seems like everyone talks about and everyone just like accepts as normal. And it was really interesting to see just how far back this exclusion went. So I started just by looking at the near history, looking at the 2000s onward, and saw that all throughout like the last 2 decades, there were these ongoing fights with city council and the trades about making certain publicly funded projects diverse and, you know, representative of how the city looks. But then beyond that, so then going back, like going to the 60s, going to the early 1900s, going back a century before that, like it was just like every single place we looked, we saw this exclusion of Black people. And it was stunning in that way that something that we take for granted that happens now has its roots just going so far back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, based on your research, talk about why the building trades haven't diversified at the same rate as other unions in Philadelphia.
Yeah, well, so this is such a big topic. So people often think about unions as a monolith.
Yeah.
And the truth is that there's lots and lots of different kinds of unions and different ways that unions operate. And so the skilled trade unions, the trade unions operate very differently from, say, the teachers union or a nurses union, where you might, if you get this job, then you automatically become part of the union. And that's how a teachers union would work, or a nurses union. But a trade union is different because you often join the trade union first, and that's how you get work. And so a lot of the exclusion happens that way. It's like there's a certain number of positions. So in order to become part of the trade union, you need to go through an apprenticeship and like pass a test, and you have to know about this, like the apprenticeship. You have to know that this opportunity exists. And so that's one barrier already that keeps people out. And then there's a culture thing. So I talked to Charisse Ferris, the Black carpenter that I had profiled, and you know, she has been very successful at her union job. But one reason that she was able to get into the union was the carpenters had a program that targeted specifically like people who did not have any family in the union, and Charisse was a person like that. Because generally, like if you're in the union, it's like your father was in the union, or your grandfather was in the union, or your uncle, or many people in your family. And Charisse didn't have that in. But so she was able to take this what they call a pre-apprenticeship, and they trained her, and they, you know, taught her how to build a birdhouse, and taught her how to like make this and make that, and sort of prep her for what would be on the test. And that was invaluable for her. She was able to like do her apprenticeship and then graduate to be a journey person.
Yeah, I mean, Charisse's story was so powerful and really talks about the opportunity that is available for Philadelphians living today, but also just how rare that opportunity is for people who look like Charisse, right, in this city. I guess, what did you take away from her story in terms of the possibilities for folks who are really finding a way to the middle class through unions, or who could, if only it was more open and equal in terms of access?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the top thing I took away from it was how much it changed her life.
Yes, me too.
She was working at ShopRite for a lot of her 20s and started at basically minimum wage, and you would get like little raises. I think it was like every 6 months, but you topped out at like 13 an hour. And she had 3 kids then she had her 4th, and it was like, she was just like, I can't, I can't support my family this way. And as soon as she became an apprentice, she started making 18 an hour, she was like, her whole life like changed, and she felt it then. And that wasn't even like the top rate that she was going to make when she became a journey person. And so just hearing her talk about the freedom to take her family out to Jamaican food, to treat them to that whenever she wanted, to say yes to her kids more. Just to give them,
move to a better neighborhood. All of
yeah,
those.
yeah, and she dreaming about moving them to a different neighborhood. All of those things, like, yeah, it was just, yeah, she talked about it as freedom, like having freedom, which really marked me. And another thing was that she spoke really candidly about her experiences on job sites where, you know, you're not just working with your union, you're working with lots of different unions, trade unions that are predominantly white. And she had to deal with just like, it was hard for her sometimes. She was like, yeah, there's just like racist graffiti in the porta potties. It's just like, you just have to accept that. That's something that happens. Or people talk about stuff like, kind of making these like microaggression, like coded comments about affirmative action, being like, oh, I haven't been able to find a job for 2 years because I'm not Black. Like just stuff like that, really insensitive and frankly racist. But she's just like, you know what, this is my job. Like I put up with it because of exactly what I said, because it changed her life that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering, in your reporting, what was your sense that these trade unions, you know, as an institution, their awareness of this inequality and their efforts to try to change it?
Yeah, the union. So that's interesting. I spoke with Ryan Boyer, who is the head of the Laborers District Council, and he's also the head of the Building Trades in Philadelphia. So that's an umbrella organization for many different trade unions.
And he's a first in that role. That's right.
Yeah, well, he's Black, and he's the first Black man to ever hold this role. So this is the building trades have been led by white men since the beginning of their forming. And he said that he knows that there is work to be done. And he said that he and all the other heads of the building trades unions want to see their unions look like the city. And at the same time, he said that the building trades unions are doing better than the Inquirer and doing better than the legal industry and city contracting when it comes to diversity. And, you know, I'm the first to say that the Inquirer needs to do better on diversity of our staff. But I also think that, you know, looking at unions versus something like the legal industry, unions their goal is to have like workers' rights for all. That is like their like very lofty and like ambitious goal. And so diversity is incredibly important for something like the labor movement.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want to make the audience aware we are going to have time to take some questions. So if you do have questions for Juliana or questions about her article, you can send them along, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can over the course of our conversation. Juliana, you talked about Sharice's story as something that it sounds like that story really impacted and stayed with you. I'm wondering if there was anything else over the course of your reporting that surprised you or that really stuck with you coming out of it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, with thinking about Sharice, I was so grateful about how candid she was with me, talking about race as someone in the building trades has been historically extremely difficult for folks. And there's stories about this. There's stories about people speaking up, Black people in the trades speaking up and being beaten. This is in the 60s. This happened in the 60s, the 70s at the operating engineers. There was a man named John Dent and another colleague of his they were beaten by their fellow union members after they had testified in a discrimination court hearing. And stories like this persist about Black people being blackballed, basically not being able to get work because they spoke up. And so for Charisse to talk to me about what she was going through, and yeah, candidly, and yet, she didn't only talk about negative things. There was lots of really positive things about her experience. But yeah, that marked me. It was like incredibly brave. And it's really hard to do stories as a reporter on racism in certain industries and places precisely because of this like chilling effect of like, what are the consequences going to be? And so when I was the labor reporter for the Inquirer, I actually didn't touch racism in the building trades too much because I felt like it was too hard to report on because people are so scared to speak up.
Yeah, I mean, that brings me to a question that I was thinking about I mean, really just why this has been such an intractable issue in our city, in our country, making these unions more open, more equitable. Why is it that hasn't happened yet, especially if, to your point, unions exist for the rights of all workers?
Yeah. Well, when I talk to union leaders, a lot of what they say is that because the Philadelphia schools are so underfunded, that many of the kids that graduate from there like can't pass the apprenticeship tests. And so that's why they've started pre-apprenticeships, like the one I described that Charisse did at the Carpenters, that are geared towards training students to be able to pass them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think another reason is that like we've seen city council and politicians try to hold the building trades accountable by creating these deals with them where they're like, okay, you're going to work on this multi-million-dollar public project like the stadium project or the convention center expansion, and in order to get this job, you're going to need to hit certain benchmarks. And we've just not seen that work when it comes to diversifying the trades. And so, I mean, I'm interested to hear more from like it should be a priority for politicians. And I think it feels like right now that it hasn't really been like a very present issue. Perhaps just because it's been going on so long, there's a kind of complacency about it or a feeling that like things won't change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to take a chance to ask a question from our audience. We have a question asking, where did you get the data on the number of union workers in the building construction trades?
Yeah, so in the story, we quote, so there were a few different sources. We talked about the Philadelphia building trades, and we talked about the most recently available data, which was from 2012, that had been reported by a former Inquirer journalist, actually, Tom Ferrick Jr., for a publication called Access Philly. And he got that from the city because the office, what was then called the Office of Supportive Housing, they had to keep track of the demographics of workers that worked on publicly funded or federally funded projects. So that's where we got those numbers. And yeah, and I actually got more recent data that I'm going to write a story about. But I compared the data, and in the more recent data, things hadn't really changed. They had just gotten slightly more diverse.
Gotcha. Wayne Wormley asks, are the viewers here aware of the Philadelphia plan that was the first affirmative action program developed by the federal government under President Johnson? Talk about that, because you mentioned the Philadelphia plan in the story, Juliana, so I'm hoping you can maybe share a little bit more. Wayne's asking about that plan, and it is in the story.
Yeah, thank you, Wayne. That we were so excited when we found that the team, because we were like, oh, wow, this is perfect. It was a very early affirmative action program by the federal government to make workforces diverse when it came, if they were federally funded. And so the unions had to meet certain benchmarks or they wouldn't be able to get, or sorry, it was not the unions, but the contractors had to meet specific benchmarks or they wouldn't be able to like get this work. But okay, so there was that. And then there was tons of pushback against this Philadelphia plan. The unions hated it. Some politicians hated it. They said it was reverse racism, discrimination. Yeah, discrimination in reverse. And they basically said they were being told to take a job away from a white man and give it to a black man, and that they could not do that. And in the end, though some federal data says that the contractors and thus the unions had met the benchmarks, it was pretty universally thought of as not a successful program in terms of diversifying the trades.
Yeah. Well, that was definitely a part of history that I didn't know about before I read your story. So thank you for including that and for all of your fantastic reporting. I want to bring in some other people to join us in this discussion. We have got Donna Rilling, who is a history professor at Stony Brook University. We've got Mr. Woody, Executive Director of the Youth Outreach Adolescent Community Awareness Program. And we've got Paul Prescott, who is a teacher and union activist, and he wrote a sidebar to this chapter of A More Perfect Union called A Better Life. Thank you so much to all of you for joining this discussion.
Thank you.
Well, I already had a chance to kind of talk to Juliana about her takeaways from this chapter about unions. I'm wondering what your takeaways were and how each of you, if you could just talk about how this changed, if at all, how you think about the role of unions in our society. And we can start with you, Mr. Woody.
So UACAP, we are a pre-apprenticeship program, and we work with youth and young adults in the city of Philadelphia. So I actually got into the Carpenters Union when I was 18, and I went to Mass Bomb, and then, you know, even though my dad was a carpenter, he was against me getting into the union. But for me, it was difficult to get in. And once I got into the union initially, it was a shocker. So it wasn't pre-apprenticeship programs at that time. So, you know, we had to deal with people talking to us a certain way, and you know, sometimes it felt unfair. But I think unions from that time to now really want somebody to work hard and want somebody to be on time. And I think a lot has changed since when I got into the union to now. There are a lot of programs like that y'all mentioned, like the CART program to help people. The FTI has a program. So, you know, I just think it's a little different now. I mean, some of the things that you talked about still exist and things need to improve, but I think it has come a long way, and I can speak about it further, but I don't want to take up all the time.
Okay. Well, no, thank you. And thank you for sharing your own story about how you came to be involved with unions. Professor Rilling, what about you? You contributed to this chapter. Were there things that you learned from Juliana's reporting? Were there things that have changed how you think about unions and their role in Philadelphia and in our society?
Well, my research really doesn't go beyond the 1850s, so pretty much anything that Juliana wrote about in the piece was not entirely news to me. It fit into the larger context of union and labor history. It's one of the things I think about in terms of the carpenters or the building trades unions are that, you know, there was quite a push in the turn of the 20th century and early 20th century to deal with unions by relocating industries to other places. Well, you can't really do that so well in things like the building trades. So sure, you can do prefab and things like that, and that can make a difference in terms of what you can do. But that was a big strategy by corporations, employers to bust unions over time is to get them out. And so I suppose in some respects, building trades have a very particular history that's a little bit different than some of the other industries because they are not mobile industries.
Yeah. Well, staying with you, Professor Rilling, I mean, like you said, you talked about kind of the early history of labor unions, and I wonder what you can share with our audience about what we can learn from the history of those labor unions and how that makes the case for why they should be diversified.
Yeah, well, this question of systemic racism, which I'm not disputing here, but the conditions in the colonial and the 18th century period are much as Juliana was saying, that people apprentice their nephews and their children to other people in other trades, and so the master carpenters, many of whom were initially Quakers, really did have something of a tight network and hold over the apprenticeship process. They never had as much hold as they really wanted because there's always immigration and migration from other places and there's demand because in strong housing markets, not everybody went through as much of a formal apprenticeship as presumably they should have. Apprenticeships took very long periods of time. You might have been apprenticed as a boy at about age 11 until you were 21. And then you could go out and claim that you were capable of working on your own. You could be a wage worker for another master carpenter, and pardon the language of the art of the craft process, but that is what it's called. And your ability to actually move up the ladder and become an employer of your own really depended upon the very mercurial economy, lots of ups and downs, no real federal support or banking system to speak of at that period of time that's going to step in and solve economic problems in any way. And if you're going to get ahead, you're going to have access to credit. And Blacks who did have some skill, many of whom migrated from the Upper South or from cities in the Lower South, Charleston, for example, but principally the Upper South, Richmond, for example, or Norfolk, may well have had carpentry and other building trades experience, but they would not have been recognized so much as that. They're always really recognized as laborers in the 1800s. So their ability to gain access to build speculative developments, which is really what can boost you considerably and boost the prospects of your next generation or two, isn't easily attainable and isn't there. So those are credit barriers are real, as well as apprenticeship and employment barriers were definitely real, and stemmed to a large degree from the lack of that formal training, but also the fact that the white trade in Philadelphia was very much, interestingly, not unlike Juliana described for the 20th century or early 21st century, that the business about your uncle was in the trade or your father was in the trade. And there was a lot of commonality in that respect, linked also by religious networks, by all sorts of other kinds of networks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Mr. Woody, I want to come back to you because I want to ask about, I mean, you are somebody that is now advocating more to get more Black and brown folks into the trade unions. This is a thing that has been persistent, but as we've seen in some of the other chapters that we've written about, it is often Black and brown folks that are taking, that are using their own agency to really improve or address the inequality that is inherent in these institutions. So I'm wondering what Black folks can do to advocate for themselves more in the unions, what steps they can take to really break into the trade industry.
Well, first, there are a lot of other programs like your ACAP that are out there. There's CAP, there's First Builders. but these programs exist to help individuals. There's EDP, a part of the Urban Affairs Coalition, and they're there to help people break into the union who are people of color, men and women. And so oftentimes these programs exist, and we just have to share information about these programs around the city. These programs help you from in a lot of different ways. So a lot of times you may not understand building trade culture. So they are teaching you how to navigate through the building trades, understand how unions work. They teach you about thick skin and how you have to be when you're on a job site, how you have to be there early in the morning, which a lot of times is not like a traditional job, how you may switch job sites quite often and move from one location to the other, which a lot of times can make people feel uncomfortable, and how you may get laid off once you finish a project and then you have to find an additional work. So I think the more we can talk and spread the word about these programs that exist in the city of Philadelphia and the surrounding counties, I think it would help more people get involved in the unions. And I will say some of the unions are not, or some of the unions could do a little better. Some unions are, I think, doing a lot more to help people of color get in. And some unions feel like, quite honestly, if they're not doing it our way, then it's no need for them to, be involved. But, when you're at a disadvantage, sometimes, it's hard for them to see, that somebody may not communicate well, may not interview well, may not be able to understand building trade culture. So, you have to take a little bit more time. And I think some of the unions are doing a better job at that than others.
Yeah, it really sounds like, what we're talking about is exposure and access, right? Like that is the thing that could really make the difference and start and really address a lot of what we're talking about. Juliana, in your findings, I want to ask you, in your reporting, did you find that any of the trade unions made significant changes in hiring people of color?
It seemed like the carpenters had made a big effort to diversify. And Mr. Woody talked to me about FTI, and so that's the Finishing Trades Institute, and they're affiliated with the painters. And so I didn't focus too much on the painters, so I can't speak to that, but they have a similar pre-apprenticeship as the carpenters do. But the carpenters really, they prioritized helping them find apprentices that were not within the direct community. And so that pre-apprenticeship was majority people of color.
Okay. I want to remind our audience, thank you so much for tuning in so far. We are talking about the legacy of unions and their history in Philadelphia and the way forward. If you have a question for any of our panelists here, please submit them and I will try to get to a couple of them before we end our conversation. But Paul, I want to come to you. You wrote an essay talking about your family's experience and how you were really able to benefit from your father's union membership. Why do diverse unions matter in your opinion? How do they impact your life? How do you think we get to a more diverse union culture and community?
Yeah, sorry about my tech issues, but glad we sorted that out. It's kind of interesting. I think my piece is almost like the other side of the coin to Juliana's piece, and focus on different sectors. So, to tell my father's story, he's an immigrant, a Black immigrant from Barbados. He came to this country in 1977, and in many ways, kind of a classic immigrant story. He had dreams of becoming a musician. He played the violin. So, he would gig around a lot. He was in the Reading Symphony, Pottstown Symphony. He taught a little bit at Chestnut Hill College. And this is mostly before I was born or when I was a very little kid. And so, I've heard all the stories about how much he really struggled, how unstable, life was. He didn't own a home at that point. And it really wasn't until he became a public school teacher and joined the National Educators Association where that really was a life change. It's kind of similar to, Sharice and Juliana's piece, how it just was a game changer. And this is kind of what allowed him to have a stable life, to reasonably expect that his children could go to college. It's a big reason why actually now he's living a good life. He moved back to Barbados to retire, gets to spend time with his family, has a good pension that the union provided. And that story is really, it's not unique to my dad. For so many Black workers, especially in the public sector, that is the story, and it's a really powerful one that really resonates across generations. And I think so. There's many ways I can answer. How do we continue that legacy of a diverse union culture? I mean, one of the things is, I think, expanding the public sector. I mean, that's everything from public schools to city workers, the post office. You know, historically, this has been a haven for Black workers going back many years. And I think thinking about the private sector, like in construction, you know, not only doing better in the existing unions as they are now, but I think we need to have more infrastructure built. And we have a great opportunity in this moment where in the 21st century, we're going to need to shift to a clean energy economy. And that's a great excuse to expand apprenticeship programs, to hire many people who haven't been in the trades before. So I think there's a lot of different angles we could come at that question with.
Okay, well, I want to go to a couple of questions from our audience. Juliana, I'm going to direct this one to you because we have somebody asking, what U.S. organization has oversight over unions?
So the Department of Labor, there's a bunch of forms that unions need to figure out, to file to them, and they're the ones who are supposed to be holding unions accountable. Yeah.
And in terms of, maybe you can speak to this, Mr. Woody. Somebody is asking about just the kind of I mean, you talked about how difficult it is to kind of get into these apprenticeship opportunities, or, you know, to make the connections that you need to get one of these, even be in a position to apply for one of these. Can you talk about how difficult this is for Black workers who try to enter union apprenticeship? How successful or unsuccessful are they usually in this city for lack of connections?
So just to give you an idea, and I'm going to speak to some of what I experienced with the young people that are in our program. First, we have an 18 to 24-year-old program to help individuals that are 18 to 24. And a lot of the people that come to our program are primarily Black. And we have quite a few men and some women. And we've had very good, how do I say this the right way? A good experience of them getting into certain unions. The challenge is that oftentimes they're not ready for the test, because the test can be hard, and they're not ready for the no zero tolerance when it comes down to being late, or things like that. But I think if you are able to understand and be a part of some of the pre-apprenticeship programs, we're starting very early now in high school. So we have a schools of work program through the state, through the same program that Juliana just mentioned. Is for high school students, and we work with several schools in the city to try to help the high school students prepare. So we're getting them a little bit earlier, and then we can transition them into our building trades 18 to 24-year-old program. And so our goal is to try to get as many exposed to understanding they can work with their hands, and teach them about how to have a second and third gear, how to be on time, how to have thick skin, how to prepare if somebody's talking to you and you feel like they're disrespecting you, so you don't quit. You know, these things are a challenge, but I believe that the more we can share this information and get them involved, and encourage the state. I believe in talking to the state, we need to have more incentives for some of these companies to hire some of the individuals and keep them hired that are Black and brown in the city, and men and women, because the challenge becomes that, you know, you can have, right now we have about 60 young people that are in our program. Well, if we have 60 young people that are in our high school program, it's not enough slots, you know, and depending on the union, they're only going to take but so many individuals based on amount of new workers they can accept. So I think we need to encourage, maybe from the state level or from the federal level, more of more inclusion, and maybe some incentives built in. I'm not sure, but I think it needs to come from higher up, because I'm tired of hearing that it's people out there that's not prepared. They are prepared. It's just that you have to be open-minded and accept them in. And we've had some success with the electricians union, the FTI, the carpenters unions. A lot of the unions are open. It's just that we just have to, pound the doors, and it's up to people like us that run these pre-apprenticeship programs to collaborate better with them as well, and to ask them and demand. And sometimes you take it on the chin. I can remember one conversation I had with someone, and they was talking to me like I was an 18-year-old, but I took that on the chin because it was for the good of the larger group of people that we're representing.
Yeah. Well, Woody's kind of given us some food for thought as we come to an end here. I want to just kind of come around to the rest of the panelists and ask if you have final thoughts on why unions as an institution are so important to our society, and really why it matters that we try to get to a more equal and inclusive institution in Philadelphia, but also just across the country. Professor Rilling, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I wanted to point out that unions were often illegal until, well, it varied, but until about 1840. The only ones that were kind of countenanced before that were basically cooperation among masters, that is to say, the employers. So unions, I am union. We can celebrate that this is a period of time when we see the increase of unionization, people joining. And I think with the incredible levels of capital that is concentrated within a very small number of hands, that this is a period of time when it's really critical to make change from the majority of the people. And certainly diversity is part of that process because we are increasingly also a global world. We cannot exclude people who are really important and who are in many respects growing poorer and more disadvantaged in this process. So I love the idea that was mentioned about more contracts, that Paul had mentioned about more opportunities and the programs that could bring people into these programs that Woody mentioned. So I do hope that we can end on a very optimistic note.
Yeah. Juliana, what would you add to that?
So I'll do my take on that question. And I want to say that in my experience as a labor reporter, there was a lot of fear to criticize the labor movement or, speak to real things that were happening that might be seen as criticism. For example, lack of diversity or racism, in part because the labor movement has been so beaten down. Because labor, like union density is so low, historically low. But I don't agree with that stance. And I think that writing about things like racism in labor is really important if we want to have, a labor movement that works for everyone.
And Paul, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
No pressure. I guess I'll say, in my piece, I included some statistics that often when I cite them today, people are really surprised, that today, Black people are actually the most likely demographic to be unionized, and that, unionized Black workers make almost 20% more than non-union counterparts and all these things. I think it surprises people because I think we're in this mode of thinking now where people think union, they think white man in a hard hat. And that really has never been the case, but is really less true now than ever before. So I think we have to change this mindset and realize, not just in the future, but today, I think unions are often the dividing line in Black communities between stability or lack of stability and poverty. And this is something that has been understood for a long time, going back to the civil rights movement. I used to be a public school teacher, so I have to bring in this history angle, but one of my favorite signs when I marched on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963 is a sign that says, civil rights equals, or freedom equals civil rights plus full employment. And it kind of made me think about what Cherise said about freedom And there was always this understanding in civil rights that it can't just be about the rights part. It has to be about the economic opportunity. And the labor movement has always been front and center for that. So I think we really need to remember that going forward. And like, Mr. Woody said, thinking big, we got to think at the state and federal level. It's a tragedy that not in every single public school, there is not a career technical education program that's well funded. Think about how many kids who maybe cannot afford college are getting their life, chances cut off because they don't have access to a good union job that doesn't require a college degree. So I think, we just always need to keep in mind that the labor movement right now is so important for improving the lives of people of color. And we just need to keep expanding that opportunity every way we can.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end this on. Unions are such a big part of the American story. And so we want to talk about how we bring more people into that story, right? As they continue. So I want to thank Mr. Woody, Professor Rilling, Juliana, Paul, thank you all so much for being here. And thank you to our audience for joining us for this Inquirer Live and our latest installment of A More Perfect Union. You can read Juliana's article, Broken Rung. You can read Paul's essay, and you can also read previous articles in the More Perfect Union series by visiting inquirer.com/moreperfectunion. You can also sign up for a free newsletter so that you receive notifications about future articles as they are published. Again, I'm your host, Errin Haines, contributing editor for More Perfect Union, and I hope to see you next time on Inquirer Live. Everybody have a good evening.